Welcome to J&M, a podcast where we explore the hidden stories behind environmental disasters and the profound impact they have on communities and our health. I'm Jessica, and with me today is Matt.
Hey everyone, today we're diving into a significant event in environmental history, the PG&E water contamination crisis in Hinckley, California. A story of corporate negligence, environmental injustice, and the fight for justice that continues to happen today. We'll dive deeper into what actually went down in this small town.
In the 1950s, Pacific Gas and Electric began using a chemical called hexavalent chromium in their cooling towers at a local gas compressor station. Little did the residents of Hinckley know that the water that they were drinking and bathing in had been contaminated with this highly toxic substance for decades. Today, we're going to break down this crisis using a framework of 7 key perspectives on water and health. We'll cover the hazards, how the contamination spread, the health impacts, and more. So let's get into it. Starting with the water-related hazards that caused the crisis. Hexavalent chromium, also known as chromium-6, is a highly toxic chemical known to cause different types of cancer, respiratory problems, as well as severe liver and kidney damage. PG&E used it as part of the cooling process in their gas compressor station, and unfortunately, it ended up leaching into the local groundwater. This was a major hazard for the residents of Hinckley.
The problem was, hexavalent chromium wasn't something that could be easily detected or even smelled. Residents had no idea what was in their water, as it was invisible, and even worse, it took years before the true extent of the contamination was understood. By the time PG&E and authorities acknowledged the issue, people had been drinking and using this water for decades. PG&E also tried to cover up their action and pay doctors to try to hide what they had done.
Next, let's talk about the exposure pathways. So, how did the people of Hinckley come into contact with this hazardous chemical? Essentially, it all started with the groundwater. PG&E's operations caused hexavalent chromium to leach into the local aquifer, which supplied water to the residents of Hinckley. PG&E also didn't line their ponds initially for dumping wastewater, leading to more contamination of groundwater.
Exactly, and exposure occurred through everyday activities like drinking water, cooking, showering, and for kids often swimming. As the chemical leached into the groundwater, the residents of Hinckley had no idea that they were being exposed to this toxic substance. This type of contamination is especially dangerous because it can go unnoticed for so long. And the worst part, some of the affected wells were even used for irrigation, which meant the chemicals spread into the food supply too.
Let's move on to the health impacts, because this is where the crisis becomes even more tragic. Hexavalent chromium is classified as a carcinogen, meaning it can cause cancer, particularly lung cancer. But that's not all. It can also cause serious damage to the liver, kidneys, and immune system.
Yeah, and the residents of Hinckley began noticing a higher rate of illness, but it wasn't until years later that the connection to the water contamination was made by Aaron Brockovich. Many residents went to see doctors after their visit was paid for by PG&E, but these doctors told them they were getting sick from activities they were doing, practically lying to them. People were diagnosed with various cancers, and there were higher than average rates of respiratory issues. Sadly, some people passed away or suffered permanent health problems.
One of the most heartbreaking aspects was the impact on children, many of who were exposed to the water at a very young age. Children are particularly vulnerable to the effects of toxic chemicals like hexavalent chromium, as their bodies are still developing. The health toll was extreme, and the emotional toll on families is still being felt today. We're lucky to have Aaron Brockovich here with us today. Aaron, I have a question a lot of people might be curious about. Do you have any actual medical background or training?
No. I have kids. Learned a lot right there. Yeah, I've seen nurses give my son throat cultures and what is it? You stick a giant Q-tip down their throat and wait.
Okay, yeah. So, what made you feel that you were the right person for the role you took on in Hinckley?
I'm an extremely fast learner. You show me something in the lab once and I've got it down. I always wanted to go to medical school. You see, that was my first interest, really. But then I got married and had a kid too young, and that kind of blew that. But
Interesting. And Aaron, how do you feel about this crisis, knowing how many lives have been impacted?
Old stomping grounds, Hinckley, California, and the backside of Pacific Gas and Electric. The devastation, the destruction that has been caused. You should always put safety and people first. Do it right on the up front. Don't kick the can down the line.
Yeah, we totally agree with you, Aaron.
People have died. Gets me riled up. Pisses me off.
Yeah, for sure. It's incredibly upsetting and definitely could have been avoided. Well, thank you for your time, Aaron. We appreciate it.
Now let's talk about the interventions involved and how they were implemented. Once the community was made aware, the majority did not sit back and let this happen. Leading the community, Aaron Brockovich played a critical role in pushing for justice for these people. Aaron was a legal assistant who uncovered the truth behind the contamination and helped these residents of Hinckley take legal action against PG&E.
Yeah, Aaron Brockovich's investigation and the subsequent legal battles were a major turning point in the case. In 1996, PG&E agreed and settled a lawsuit for $333 million, which was one of the largest settlements in U.S. history at that time. But even after the settlement, the health impacts on residents were still being felt, and the issue of clean water for the community wasn't fully resolved.
The other thing to consider is the long-term implementation of these interventions. While PG&E did compensate the residents, the effort to clean up the contaminated water and hold the company fully accountable were slow and costly. It wasn't just about providing financial compensation. It was about ensuring that the community had access to safe, clean water moving forward.
When we look at the distal influences, we can see how broader systematic factors played a role in the crisis. Hinckley was a small rural town with a population that was largely dependent on agriculture. It had limited resources and little political power, which made it easier for PG&E to avoid oversight and take shortcuts with environmental safety. This was also a time when environmental regulations were a lot less strict.
Yes, and we can't ignore the socio-economic and environmental justice aspects here. Hinckley was a working-class community, and many of the people affected were already marginalized in other ways. This made it easier for corporations like PG&E to cut corners and expose people to dangerous chemicals without facing major consequences.
This now brings us to the issue of policy and its implementation. PG&E's negligence wasn't just a corporate failure, it was also a failure of public policy. At the time, there weren't strong enough environmental protections to prevent the contamination from happening in the first place.
Even when the contamination was discovered, PG&E tried to force a slow response from both local and state authorities by hiding documents. The fact that there wasn't much regulatory oversight and delayed response allowed PG&E to avoid full accountability for many years as the contamination continued. It wasn't until the public objected in legal action that the full extent of the contamination came to light.
One of the most clear issues was the lack of transparency from PG&E. They knew about the contamination but didn't disclose it to the public for many years, which left residents unknown about their health risks. This crisis shows the need for stronger environmental regulations and better corporate accountability when it comes to public health.
The investigation into the contamination was driven by a combination of activism and scientific research. Aaron Brockovich, with help from lawyer Ed Mazary, was crucial in uncovering the truth. They were able to access documents that revealed PG&E's knowledge of the contamination in their efforts to cover it up. These documents, in many cases, were often hard for them to access because PG&E tried to cover their trail.
Beyond the activism, scientific investigations confirmed the presence of hexavalent chromium in the water supply. Public health experts were able to establish a link between the contamination and the rise in cancer rates in the community. These investigations were critical in not just holding PG&E accountable, but also raising public awareness about the dangers of industrial pollution.
Another case study that was similar to this was the Flint water crisis, which had similar components of corporate negligence and government failure. In Flint, residents' drinking water was switched to highly contaminated Flint River. Residents were exposed to lead-contaminated water because of poor decision-making and the lack of proper oversight, much like in Hinckley, where PG&E's negligence caused long-term harm to the community.
Both cases show how vulnerable marginalized communities can be to environmental hazards, especially when there is a lack of regulatory oversight and corporate accountability. These case studies have been important in changing environmental policy and public awareness around corporate responsibility and water safety. So, as we wrap up the podcast, the Hinckley water contamination crisis serves as an important reminder of how environmental negligence can impact communities for generations. It's a story of corporate greed, a failure in public policy, and the complete resilience of the people who fought for justice.
This case study continues to have important effects on the public health and environmental justice movements today. In the early 2000s, a movie called Aaron Brockovich was made to bring further awareness to how PG&E affected the residents of Hinckley. While Hinckley residents received compensation, it was not enough to compare the damage left by the contamination, and the fight for safer water continued on today.
Thank you for joining us today on JNN. Stay informed, stay active, and always remember the effects of water contamination can harm entire communities for generations.
This wraps up our podcast. Thank you all for listening, and have a great day.